Hello Magic Makers, welcome to Storytime with Mombierella. This is a young adult fiction and may be inappropriate for some younger viewers.
The Beast Within, A Tale of Beauty's Prince by Serena Valentino. Copyright Disney Enterprises Incorporated, 2014. Chapter 5. The Portrait in the West Wing. In the first few months there was no sign of a curse, no taunting sisters, no beastly vestige, and no villainous servants plotting his death. The idea was laughable, really. His loyal servants growing to hate him? Ludicrous. Imagine his beloved Cogsworth or Mrs. Potts wishing for his death. Utterly inconceivable. It was pure claptrap. Nothing of which the sisters spoke came true, and he saw no reason to believe it would. As a result, he did not think he needed to repent, change his ways, or take anything those insane women had to say seriously at all. Life went on, and it was good as it had always been, with Gaston at his side, money in his pockets, and a woman to fawn over him. What more could he ask for? But as happy as he was, he couldn't completely shake the fear that perhaps Circe and her sisters were right. He noticed little changes in his appearance, small things that made him feel his mind might be betraying him, and he was somehow falling for the sisters' ruse. He had to constantly, obsessively, remind himself that there was no curse. There were only his fears and the sisters' lies, and he wasn't about to let either get the better of him. He was in his bedroom readying himself for a hunting trip with Gaston, when the porter came in to let him know his friend had arrived.
Send him up then, unless he wants to take the breakfast in the observatory while I finish getting ready.
The prince was in fine spirits and found himself feeling better than he had in a long time, but he couldn't, for the life of him, remember the porter's name. A bit concerning. But one of the advantages of being a prince is that no one questions you. So if others were noticing a change in the prince, they didn't mention it.
Are my things packed? Is everything ready for our stalking expedition?
He asked the porter. Indeed, my liege. It's all been loaded. If there's nothing else that you require, then I shall see to the other gentlemen's things. The prince had to laugh. Gaston, a gentleman? Hardly. The porter was too young to remember when Gaston and the prince had been boys. Some of the older staff would remember. Mrs. Potts would remember, to be sure. She'd often recounted old stories about the boys as children, laughing at the memory of them, running to the kitchen and pleading with her for sweets after their grand adventures, both of them covered in mud, tracking it throughout the castle like little boys love to do, making a maid trail after them, a maid who muttered curses under her breath the entire time. Curses.
Put them out of your mind. Remember something else. Mrs. Potts.
She loved telling the stories of how the boys had convinced themselves the castle ground had been plagued by an evil dragon. On more than one occasion the boys went off adventuring all day, and were gone well into the night, making everyone sick with worry over what might have befallen them. And the two of them had just waltzed right in as happy and gay as could be, without a care in the world, wondering what the fuss was all about. That was how those boys had been. The prince wondered how much they'd actually changed, though Mrs. Potts reminded him at every opportunity that both he and Gaston had changed a great deal. She often said she didn't see much of the little boys she once adored in either of them. Changed. He had changed, hadn't he? And not in the way Mrs. Potts feared. In other ways. She still loved him, though. She couldn't help herself. She probably even thought of Gaston as a gentleman. She always treated him as such. She saw the best in everyone when she could, and encouraged their friendship when they were young, even though he was the gamekeeper's son. It shouldn't matter who his father is, young master. He is your friend, and has proven to be a very good one at that. He remembered feeling terrible for letting a thing like status make him reconsider a friendship with Gaston. None of that mattered. Not now. Gaston had his own lands and people to work them. The prince had seen to that. And that life, when they were so young, when Gaston lived with his father in the stable quarters, it all seemed so far away and long ago. Gaston's very voice interrupted his thoughts.
Prince, why are you standing there, daydreaming, when you should be readying yourself? We have a long journey ahead of us.
I was remembering when we were younger, Gaston, recalling our earlier adventures. Do you remember the time you saved my life in the...
Gaston's face hardened.
You know I don't like to talk about that, Prince. Must you always remind me that I am not your equal?
That wasn't my aim, dear friend.
Nevertheless, it is the result.
The prince felt scolded. Gaston seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, now musing over the large portrait of the prince hanging over the fireplace.
When did you sit for this portrait? How long ago was it? 5 years?
It was finished only a quarter of a year ago. You remember? It was done by that wild, eccentric painter. He called himself Maestro, remember? He seemed to live in another world altogether, with his pretty speeches about preserving our youth, and making time stand still through the magic of deception.
I do. Yes. He was very, interesting.
Interesting. You wanted to toss him out of the nearest window, if I recall.
The two laughed, but Gaston seemed to be preoccupied with thoughts other than those about strange painters and their proclamations of preserving a moment in time.
I suppose there is something to his insane ramblings, though. I do seem much changed since this was painted. Look around the eyes in the painting. There's no sign of lines. But if you see here, it does look as though I've aged more than 5 years.
You sound like a woman, Prince, worrying about lines around your eyes. Next, you'll be wondering what color petticoat looks best with a blue dress. Shall I inquire with your fairy godmother?
The prince laughed, but it wasn't genuine. Gaston continued.
We have better things to do than waste the day clucking away like a couple of hens. Meet me in the observatory for breakfast when you've finished getting ready.
Yes, feel free to start without me. I'm sure Mrs. Potts is in a tizzy that it's taken us this long to get down there.
The portrait was still bothering him. How had his eyes become so lined in just a few months? Was it possible they'd looked like this at the time, and the painter wished to compliment him by making him seem younger? No. The maestro was very specific about preserving that moment in time, making it as pure and realistic as possible, freezing a moment that could never be diminished or altered, preserving it for the generations so they might evoke something of his memory once he was long gone. So the man had said, almost word for word. It seemed contrary to his annoying speeches and proclamations for him to have painted the prince any differently than he had appeared at the time. So Gaston was right? Had he aged 5 years in just over 3 months? Or was Gaston simply being mean-spirited because he'd reminded him of when he was young? Could it be? No. But what if Circe's curse was real? Then he remembered the sister's mirror. He'd tucked it away the night the fiendish harpies gave it to him, and hadn't given it a second thought. Their words started to ring in his ears, and he couldn't take his mind off the hellish thing.
It will show you as the beast you're bound to become.
He walked over to the mantel. Sitting on top was a voluminous tortoise-shell cat with narrowed yellow eyes lined in black. She looked down at him, scrutinizing him, as he looked for the button that opened the secret compartment within the fireplace mantel. The fireless pit was flanked with 2 griffins with red ruby eyes that sparkled in the morning light. He pressed one of the eyes inward, and it recessed into the griffin's skull. Each griffin had a crest on its chest. The crest on the griffin to the right popped out, revealing the compartment containing the mirror. The prince just stood there looking at it. The mirror had landed face down when he tossed it in. He stared at its backside. It was seemingly harmless, a simple silver hand mirror, almost entirely black now from tarnish. He reached in, grabbing the mirror by its handle. It was cold in his hand, and he fancied he could feel the evil of the sisters penetrating him by simply touching it. Fancy. He held it to his chest for a moment, not wanting to look at himself, wondering if this was folly. He was letting the sisters get to him. He had promised himself he wouldn't surrender to fears and superstitions, yet he found himself wanting to look into the mirror, and he was worried about what he might see.
Enough of this foolishness.
He gathered his courage, lifted the mirror, and looked into it unflinchingly, determined to face his fears. At first glance, he didn't seem much changed. His heart felt lighter, and he indeed felt foolish for letting the sisters' threats invade his thoughts.
Look closer, Prince.
He dropped the mirror and was afraid he had broken it. though it might have been a blessing if he had. He was sure it was Lucinda's voice he'd heard, taunting, from the black ether, or wherever she deigned to dwell. It was hell itself for all he knew. Picking up the mirror with a shaking hand, he took a second look. This time, he did see deep lines around his eyes. Gaston was right. He looked a good 5 years older, after just a few months. The lines made his face look cruel, heartless. All the things Circe had said he was. Impossible. His heart started to pound like thunder. It was pounding so violently he felt as if it would burst within his chest. Then came the laughter. It surrounded him, cacophonous. The wicked cackling seemed to come from lands unseen. Their voices, their vindictive words, entrapped him, causing his anxieties to overwhelm him. His vision became narrowed, and soon all he saw were the cat's yellow eyes staring at him from the mantel. Then everything closed in on him, and his world became black. Nothingness. He was alone in the darkness, with only the sisters' laughter and his own dread to keep him company. He awoke what seemed like days later, feeling as if he'd been beaten by a gang of black guards. His entire body ached, and he could barely move. The sisters had ensured his misery and compounded it with their laughter and taunting, leaving him ill and suffering.
"Oh, you're awake, sir,"
said Cogsworth from the corner chair where he'd been sitting.
"We were very worried about you, sir."
What happened?
The prince's head was still slightly befogged, and he couldn't quite get his bearings.
"Well, it seems, sir, you were very ill, suffering from a severe fever. When you hadn't come down for breakfast, I came up to find you lying on the floor."
Where's the mirror?
"The mirror, sir? Oh, yes, I put it in your dressing stand."
The prince's panic subsided.
Was it all a dream then? All fancy brought on by worry and illness?
"I don't know what you mean, sir, but you were rather ill. We're all very much relieved to hear you are out of the woods, as they say."
Cogsworth was putting on a brave face, as he always did, but the prince could tell. He'd been worried. He looked tired, worn, and uncustomarily rumpled. He was usually fastidious. It was a credit to his loyalty that it seemed he had been at the prince's side during his entire illness.
Thank you, Cogsworth. You're a good man.
"Thank you, sir. It was nothing."
Before Cogsworth could be embarrassed any further, the porter poked his head in sheepishly to say, "Excuse me, sir. It's just that Mrs. Potts wants Cogsworth down in the kitchens."
"Here now, I won't have Mrs. Potts telling me where I'm needed,"
grumbled Cogsworth.
No, she's right. You look like you could use a good cup of tea.
Said the prince.
I'm fine. Go to the kitchens before she waddles her way up here, getting angrier with each flight of stairs she has to take to reach us.
Cogsworth laughed at the thought of it.
"Perhaps you're right, sir."
He left the room, taking the porter along with him. The prince felt incredibly foolish for thinking he had actually been cursed. As he looked out the window, the trees were violently swaying, dancing in a manic song only they were privy to. He longed to be out of doors, tracking elk and talking with his friend about anything other than the sisters, Circe, or curses. As if by magic, there was a knock on the door. It was Gaston.
"My friend, I heard you were awake. That Cogsworth wouldn't let anyone in your room, except Dr. Hillsworth, who just came downstairs to let us know you were finally on your way to health."
Yes, Gaston. I'm feeling much better. Thank you.
Looking at Gaston, the prince noticed he hadn't shaven in more than a few days, and the prince wondered how long he had been ill.
Have you been here all along, good friend?
"I have. Cogsworth gave me a room in the east wing, but I spent most of my time down in the kitchens with Mrs. Potts and the others."
Gaston seemed almost like the young boy the prince had befriended so many years earlier. His face tensed with worry over his friend's illness, and spending his time in the kitchen, like the other servants' children.
Stay as long as you like. This was once your home, friend, and I want you to always feel it is such.
Gaston looked touched by the sentiment, but didn't say so.
"I'm going to make myself presentable before heading home. I'm sure things have gone to the winds without me there for so many days."
Surely LeFou has it handled.
The prince tried not to look disappointed his friend was making plans to leave.
"Doubtful. He's a fool at best. Don't fret, my friend. I'm sure Cogsworth will be up shortly to keep you company and help you to make plans for the party we're throwing the moment you're well enough."
party?
the prince asked. Gaston gave one of his magic smiles, the kind that always ensured he would get his way.
Yes, a party, my friend. One that will be remembered throughout the ages.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this reading. If you haven't had a chance to, please take a second, like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, comment down below, share with a friend, and check out some of the other Villain series chapters and books as well. Join us next time, and remember, let it go and keep moving forward. Have a magical day. Bye!